Good evening, and welcome to Truth Report. I'm Alex Truth, and tonight we are tracking a series of developments that, taken together, paint a striking picture of how military power, cartel violence, and authoritarian legal systems are reshaping the global order right now, in real time.
I'm Maya Clarity, and this is not your typical news roundup. Tonight we're connecting dots that most outlets won't. From a massive naval gun spotted on a Chinese test vessel in Dalian, to the killing of one of the world's most wanted drug lords triggering chaos across Mexico, to Gulf states closing ranks over Iraqi boundary disputes, to Hong Kong's courts systematically dismantling what remains of political opposition. These stories are linked by a common thread: the aggressive consolidation of power.
We're going to take you deep into each of these stories, verify what we know, challenge what we don't, and ask the questions that matter. So let's get started. Our first story tonight takes us to the Liaonan shipyard in Dalian, in China's northeastern Liaoning province, where photographs have emerged on Chinese social media showing something that should concern every defense analyst in the Pacific.
That's right. A 155mm naval gun, the largest weapon in the People's Liberation Army Navy's arsenal, has been spotted mounted on the bow of a test vessel. Now, 155mm translates to about 6.1 inches, and to put that in perspective, most modern naval guns are in the 76 to 127mm range. This is a significant step up in firepower, and the implications are enormous.
Let's break down what we know. The South China Morning Post, reporting out of Hong Kong, has confirmed that these photos show the weapon at the Liaonan shipyard. Defense analysts who examined the images estimate the barrel length suggests a weapon designed for extended-range land attack capability. This is not primarily an anti-ship weapon. This is a gun built to bombard coastal targets, to soften up beaches, to support troops hitting a shoreline.
And that's where we need to say the word that everyone in the defense community is thinking but few are saying plainly enough: Taiwan. A 155mm naval gun of this type would be a critical asset in any amphibious landing operation. During a beach assault, you need sustained, heavy fire support to suppress enemy defenses before and during the landing. Aircraft and missiles are part of that equation, but a large-caliber naval gun provides something they can't: persistent, on-call fire that can be adjusted in real time as ground conditions change.
Now, China has been building up its amphibious capabilities for years. We've tracked the expansion of the PLA Navy's Type 075 landing helicopter docks, the Type 076 that's under construction with a full-length flight deck, and the growing fleet of Type 071 amphibious transport docks. Each of these represents a piece of the puzzle. But firepower, direct fire support for troops going ashore, has been a recognized gap. This 155mm gun appears designed to fill exactly that gap.
What's also significant is the caliber choice. 155mm is the NATO standard for land-based artillery. China's own PLA ground forces use 155mm howitzers extensively. That means ammunition compatibility. You could potentially use the same shells, the same supply chain, for both your land-based artillery and your naval guns. That's a logistical advantage that simplifies an already impossibly complex amphibious operation.
And let's talk about range. Modern 155mm artillery systems using extended-range munitions and rocket-assisted projectiles can reach targets well beyond 40 kilometers. Some advanced rounds push past 70 kilometers. If this naval gun achieves anything close to those ranges, it could provide fire support from well offshore, beyond the range of many coastal defense systems. That changes the calculus for any defender significantly.
We should also note the strategic messaging here. These photos appeared on Chinese social media. In a country where the internet is heavily censored and military information is tightly controlled, images of a new weapons system don't just leak accidentally. Beijing is choosing to let the world see this. That's a signal, a deliberate one, aimed at Taipei, at Washington, at Tokyo, and at every capital in the Indo-Pacific that has a stake in the status quo in the Taiwan Strait.
The timing matters too. This comes amid continued PLA military exercises near Taiwan, ongoing tensions over U.S. arms sales to the island, and a broader pattern of Chinese military modernization that has accelerated dramatically over the past 5 years. The PLA Navy is now the largest navy in the world by hull count, and it is rapidly closing the qualitative gap with the United States Navy. This gun is another data point in a very clear trend line.
And for those who might dismiss this as just another weapons test, consider the broader context of China's military shipbuilding. The Dalian shipyard complex, where this gun was spotted, is one of the most important naval construction facilities in the world. It's where China has built aircraft carriers. The fact that this weapon is being tested there tells you something about the priority Beijing is placing on it. This is not a side project. This is a program with resources and institutional backing.
The question that defense planners in Washington, Taipei, and across the region are asking tonight is straightforward: how quickly can this system move from testing to deployment? And the honest answer is, we don't know. But China's track record on military development timelines has consistently surprised Western analysts by how fast programs move from prototype to operational capability. The assumption should be that this gun will be deployed sooner than anyone is comfortable with.
Now let's turn to our second and third stories tonight, which are deeply intertwined. Violence has erupted across Mexico following what is being described as the killing of the country's most wanted man, the cartel kingpin known as El Mencho. His real name is Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, and he was the leader of the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, or CJNG, one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations on the planet.
Al Jazeera is reporting that Mexican special forces carried out the operation that killed El Mencho. Now, this is a man who had a bounty of up to $10 million on his head from the United States Drug Enforcement Administration. He was one of the DEA's most wanted fugitives, accused of flooding the United States with fentanyl, methamphetamine, and other drugs that have killed tens of thousands of Americans. On paper, his death sounds like a victory for law enforcement. But the reality on the ground tells a very different story.
A wave of violence has swept across Mexico in the immediate aftermath. And this is a pattern we have seen before, repeatedly, in the so-called war on drugs. When you decapitate a cartel, when you remove the leader, you don't destroy the organization. What you do is create a power vacuum, and that vacuum gets filled with blood. Rival factions within the CJNG will fight each other for control. Competing cartels like the Sinaloa cartel will move to seize territory. And the people who pay the price are ordinary Mexican citizens caught in the crossfire.
Let's look at the history. When Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was captured and eventually extradited to the United States, the Sinaloa cartel didn't collapse. It fractured into warring factions, and violence escalated. When the Zetas cartel lost its leadership, the same thing happened. Going back further, when Pablo Escobar was killed in Colombia in 1993, the cocaine trade didn't stop. It dispersed and in many ways became harder to combat. The kingpin strategy, as it's known in policy circles, has a decades-long track record of producing short-term headlines and long-term chaos.
And the CJNG under El Mencho was arguably the most organizationally sophisticated cartel Mexico has ever seen. They controlled drug production, trafficking routes, money laundering networks, and had extensive corruption networks reaching into Mexican law enforcement, the military, and political institutions at every level. That infrastructure doesn't disappear because one man is killed. The labs still exist. The trafficking routes still exist. The corrupt officials are still in place. The demand for drugs in the United States hasn't changed by a single gram.
What's deeply troubling is the immediate spike in violence. When we see reports of attacks, blockades, and killings erupting across multiple Mexican states within hours of the announcement, that tells you something about the CJNG's operational capacity. Even with their leader dead, they can project force across a vast geographic area almost instantaneously. That's not the response of a defeated organization. That's the response of a deeply entrenched paramilitary force that has contingency plans and local commanders with the authority and the weaponry to act independently.
We also need to talk about the fentanyl crisis, because El Mencho's CJNG was at the center of it. The cartel had industrialized the production of synthetic fentanyl, sourcing precursor chemicals primarily from China, manufacturing the drug in clandestine labs across Mexico, and smuggling it into the United States through an elaborate network of tunnels, vehicles, and human couriers. Killing El Mencho does nothing to disrupt the chemical supply chain, nothing to shut down the labs, and nothing to address the epidemic of addiction that drives demand.
And let's be blunt about the geopolitical dimension here. The United States has been pressuring Mexico intensely on cartel enforcement. There have been serious tensions between Washington and Mexico City over sovereignty, over extradition, over the use of American intelligence assets on Mexican soil. The killing of El Mencho will be presented as a success story by both governments. But the question we should be asking is, success for whom? If violence escalates, if the drug trade continues unabated, if innocent people die in the power struggle that follows, then who actually benefited from this operation?
The communities along trafficking routes, the families of the more than 100,000 people who have disappeared in Mexico's drug war, the migrants who are extorted and kidnapped by cartels, none of them are safer tonight because El Mencho is dead. They may in fact be in greater danger as competing factions fight for control of the lucrative territory he once dominated. That's the brutal arithmetic of the kingpin strategy, and it's an arithmetic that policymakers in both Mexico City and Washington have refused to honestly confront for decades.
There's also the question of what comes next for the CJNG specifically. Intelligence analysts have identified several potential successors, but a smooth transition of power in a criminal organization is rare. More likely, we'll see fragmentation, with regional commanders asserting independence, forming alliances with other groups, or going to war with each other. Each of those scenarios produces more violence, more instability, and more suffering for the Mexican people.
And we should note that the timing of this operation, whatever the operational reasons behind it, comes at a politically sensitive moment. Drug policy, border security, and cartel violence are major political issues in both the United States and Mexico. A high-profile kill like this generates enormous media coverage and political capital. But the structural problems, the demand for drugs, the poverty that drives recruitment, the corruption that enables trafficking, those remain untouched. We've seen this movie before, and we know how it ends.
Let's move now to the Middle East, where a different kind of power struggle is playing out. Gulf countries are rallying behind Kuwait after Iraq submitted new maritime boundary coordinates to the United Nations. This is a story that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves, but it touches on some of the most sensitive issues in the region: sovereignty, borders, and access to waterways that are critical for global energy markets.
Here's what happened. Iraq submitted new maritime coordinates to the UN that effectively redraw its maritime boundaries. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, Qatar, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, essentially the entire Gulf Cooperation Council, have come out and expressed support of Kuwait's sovereignty and its existing maritime rights. That's a remarkable show of unity, and it tells you how seriously these countries are taking Iraq's move.
To understand why this matters, you need to understand the geography. Kuwait and Iraq share a border at the northern end of the Persian Gulf, and the maritime boundary between them has been a source of tension for decades. In fact, disputes over Kuwait's sovereignty were the pretext Saddam Hussein used to invade Kuwait in 1990, triggering the Gulf War. The boundary was formally established by a UN commission in 1993, and Iraq accepted it in 2013. So the question is, why is Baghdad now attempting to redraw the lines?
There are several factors at play. Iraq's access to the Persian Gulf is extremely limited. It has a coastline of only about 58 kilometers, one of the shortest of any Gulf state. That narrow window is Iraq's lifeline for oil exports, its primary source of revenue. Any changes to maritime boundaries could affect shipping lanes, port access, and potentially access to offshore resources. For Iraq, this is an existential economic issue.
But for Kuwait and the other GCC states, Iraq's unilateral submission of new coordinates to the UN is seen as a provocative and destabilizing act. Borders in the Gulf region are not just lines on a map. They represent hard-won diplomatic agreements, often brokered after conflict and bloodshed. To reopen those agreements, especially through a unilateral submission to an international body, is to challenge the entire framework of regional stability.
And the speed and unanimity of the GCC response is telling. These countries don't always agree. Qatar was blockaded by Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Bahrain from 2017 to 2021. Oman often charts its own diplomatic course. But on this issue, they closed ranks immediately. That sends a very clear message to Baghdad: you are isolated on this, and the Gulf states will not tolerate attempts to redraw maritime boundaries unilaterally. It also signals to the broader international community that the GCC views this as a red line.
There's also a broader geopolitical context here. Iraq's government has deep ties to Iran, which has its own complicated relationship with the Gulf states. Any shift in Iraq's maritime boundaries could have implications for Iranian interests in the Gulf as well. And the United States, which maintains significant military assets in the region, including its Fifth Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, has a strategic interest in maintaining the status quo on Gulf maritime boundaries. This is a situation that could escalate if not handled carefully through diplomatic channels.
What concerns analysts is the precedent. If one country can unilaterally submit new boundary coordinates to the UN and have them taken seriously, it invites other countries in the region to do the same. The Persian Gulf is one of the most geopolitically sensitive waterways on Earth. Roughly 20% of the world's oil passes through it. The stability of maritime boundaries is not an abstract legal question. It's a matter of global energy security. The GCC states understand this, which is why their response has been so forceful and so unified.
We should also note that this dispute has domestic political dimensions in Iraq. Iraqi leaders face pressure to assert national sovereignty and to be seen as standing up for Iraqi interests. Submitting new maritime coordinates may play well domestically, even if it creates problems internationally. That's a dynamic we see in many countries, where leaders make provocative moves on the international stage to shore up support at home, sometimes without fully calculating the consequences.
And for Kuwait specifically, this is deeply personal. Kuwaitis have living memory of the 1990 invasion. The trauma of occupation, the destruction of infrastructure, the environmental catastrophe of the oil fires, those are not abstract historical events. They are part of the national consciousness. Any move by Iraq that appears to challenge Kuwaiti sovereignty, no matter how it's framed in legal or bureaucratic terms, triggers deep-seated fears and a visceral response. That emotional dimension is real and should not be underestimated.
Our final story tonight takes us back to Hong Kong, where a court has dismissed the appeals of 12 opposition activists in what has been called the city's largest national security case. This is the case that grew out of an unofficial primary election held in 2020, in which pro-democracy candidates participated in a process to coordinate their strategy for upcoming legislative elections. For that, 47 people were prosecuted.
Let's be absolutely clear about what happened here. The South China Morning Post reports that the Court of Appeal upheld the convictions and sentences, ruling that the unofficial 2020 primary election was subversive and that the 7-year starting point for jail terms was not, in the court's words, manifestly excessive. Think about that for a moment. Organizing a primary election, a fundamental democratic exercise practiced in countries around the world, has been deemed an act of subversion in Hong Kong, punishable by years in prison.
The court also upheld the acquittal of barrister Lawrence Lau Wai-chung, which is at least one piece of this ruling that didn't further erode legal protections. But the broader picture is devastating. These 12 activists who appealed their convictions or sentences have now exhausted a critical avenue of legal recourse. They join the others among the 47 who pleaded guilty or were convicted at trial. The message from Beijing, delivered through Hong Kong's judiciary, could not be clearer: political opposition will not be tolerated.
To understand the significance, you need to remember what Hong Kong was promised. Under the one country, two systems framework established when Britain handed the territory back to China in 1997, Hong Kong was guaranteed a high degree of autonomy, including freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, and an independent judiciary for 50 years until 2047. The national security law imposed by Beijing in June 2020 effectively shredded those guarantees decades ahead of schedule.
The 47 activists prosecuted in this case include some of Hong Kong's most prominent pro-democracy figures, former lawmakers, district councillors, academics, lawyers, and community organizers. These are not radicals. These are people who believed in working within the system, who participated in elections, who sought change through democratic means. And for that belief, for that participation, they have been imprisoned.
The legal reasoning of the court deserves scrutiny as well. The prosecution's case rested on the argument that by organizing a primary election to select candidates who would then, if elected, use their veto power over the government's budget as leverage, the activists were conspiring to subvert state power. But using legislative powers to check executive authority is the fundamental purpose of a legislature in any democratic system. What Hong Kong's courts have criminalized is not subversion. It is democracy itself.
And this ruling has implications far beyond Hong Kong. It sends a message to Taiwan about what reunification with the mainland would actually mean. It signals to the international business community that the rule of law in Hong Kong now serves the interests of the Chinese Communist Party, not the principles of justice and individual rights. And it tells every activist, journalist, and ordinary citizen in Hong Kong that the space for dissent has been closed, thoroughly and perhaps permanently.
We should also note the chilling effect this case has already had. Since the national security law was imposed and the mass arrests began, civil society in Hong Kong has been decimated. Pro-democracy media outlets have been shut down. Trade unions have dissolved. Advocacy groups have closed. Many activists and journalists have fled abroad. The vibrant, contentious, freewheeling political culture that made Hong Kong unique has been systematically dismantled. This court ruling is another nail in that coffin.
The 7-year starting point for sentences is particularly harsh. These are lengthy prison terms for what amounts to political activity. By comparison, violent criminals in many jurisdictions receive shorter sentences. The severity of the punishment is designed not just to punish these specific individuals but to deter anyone else from engaging in any form of political opposition. It is collective punishment by example, and it is working. The silence in Hong Kong today is deafening compared to the roar of the 2019 protest movement.
And let's connect this back to the international community's response, or lack thereof. When the national security law was first imposed, there were strong statements from Western governments, some sanctions, some changes to extradition treaties. But over time, the attention has faded. Business continues. Diplomatic relations continue. The world has largely accepted what has happened in Hong Kong, and that acceptance emboldens Beijing to go further, not just in Hong Kong, but potentially in other areas where it seeks to impose its authority.
Now, let's step back and look at the bigger picture, because that's what Truth Report is about. We've covered 4 stories tonight that span 3 continents: a massive naval gun being tested in China, a cartel kingpin killed in Mexico and the violence that followed, Gulf states confronting Iraqi boundary claims, and Hong Kong's courts crushing political dissent. What connects them?
The common thread is the consolidation and projection of power by state actors, and the consequences for ordinary people caught in the machinery. In China, we see a military buildup that is explicitly designed for offensive operations against a neighboring democracy. In Mexico, we see a state action against a criminal leader that may produce more violence, not less, because it addresses the symptom rather than the disease. In the Gulf, we see one state attempting to unilaterally redraw boundaries, challenging the international rules-based order. And in Hong Kong, we see the legal system being weaponized to eliminate political opposition.
In every one of these stories, the people making the decisions, the generals, the politicians, the judges, are insulated from the consequences. The Chinese officials testing that naval gun will never face the artillery fire of an amphibious assault. The Mexican and American officials who ordered the operation against El Mencho are not living in the communities that will bear the brunt of the cartel wars that follow. The Iraqi politicians submitting new boundary coordinates are not the fishermen and port workers whose livelihoods depend on stable maritime borders. And the Hong Kong judges who upheld those convictions will never spend a day in the cells where those activists will serve their 7-year sentences.
That asymmetry, between those who wield power and those who bear its consequences, is the defining feature of our political moment. And it's not unique to any one country or system. It's a global pattern. The question for all of us, as citizens, as voters, as human beings, is whether we accept that pattern as inevitable or whether we demand something better.
What strikes me about tonight's stories taken together is the role of international institutions, or rather, their limitations. The UN receives Iraq's new boundary coordinates, but can it enforce the existing ones? International courts and human rights bodies condemn what's happening in Hong Kong, but can they free a single prisoner? The DEA put a $10 million bounty on El Mencho, but can it address the root causes of drug trafficking? The international rules-based order that was supposed to prevent military aggression is watching China build the tools for exactly that. At some point, we have to ask whether the institutions we've built are adequate for the challenges we face.
And we have to ask who benefits from their inadequacy. Because the truth is, powerful actors often prefer weak international institutions. They provide the appearance of accountability without the reality. They give cover for inaction. They allow leaders to express concern while doing nothing. The GCC states rallied to support Kuwait, and that's significant precisely because it was a concrete action by regional powers who have direct stakes in the outcome. Compare that to the international response to Hong Kong, which has been largely rhetorical. The difference is instructive.
There's also a media dimension to all of this. The Chinese naval gun photos appeared on social media in a controlled information environment. The killing of El Mencho will dominate headlines while the structural failures of drug policy go unexamined. The Iraq-Kuwait boundary dispute will get minimal coverage despite its potential to destabilize the world's most important energy corridor. And Hong Kong, once a symbol of the fight for freedom, has largely faded from international attention. What gets covered, and how, shapes what we understand and what we demand.
That's exactly why shows like this exist. Not to give you a surface-level summary of the day's events, but to dig deeper, to connect the dots, to ask who benefits and who pays. The answer, in nearly every case, is that the powerful benefit and the vulnerable pay. That's not cynicism. That's the documented reality of how power operates in the 21st century.
So what should you, our audience, take away from tonight? First, watch the South China Sea and the Taiwan Strait. China's military buildup is not theoretical. It is happening, it is accelerating, and that 155mm naval gun is a tangible expression of offensive capability being developed for a specific purpose. Second, don't be fooled by the headlines about El Mencho. The drug trade is a system, not a person, and killing one leader will not save a single life from fentanyl overdose.
Third, pay attention to what's happening in the Persian Gulf. Maritime boundaries may sound like dry legal matters, but they underpin the global energy system that powers your economy, heats your home, and fills your gas tank. When those boundaries are challenged, the consequences ripple outward to touch everyone. And fourth, do not forget Hong Kong. Do not let the world's silence normalize what has happened there. 47 people were prosecuted for participating in a primary election. 12 of them just lost their appeals. That is not justice. That is political persecution, and it deserves to be called exactly that.
That's our show for tonight. I'm Alex Truth. We've given you the facts, the context, and the connections. What you do with them is up to you.
I'm Maya Clarity. Truth Report doesn't just deliver the news. We investigate it, we challenge it, and we hold the powerful to account. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. Stay informed. Stay critical. And never stop asking questions.